had to contend. Sorry about that. The first is that voters had to contend with a new regime of voting laws throughout the country. Overall, between January 2021 and September 2022, at least 21 states had enacted 42 laws that made it harder to vote. And of those, 33 restrictive laws were in effect for the midterms in 20 states. At the same time, at least 12 states had enacted 19 laws that expanded access to the vote. So voters were navigating those new policies for the first time in dozens of states across the country. The second thing that we were keeping our eye on was the fact that there were election denialists on the ballot across the country, including as candidates for Secretary of State in key battleground states like Arizona, Michigan, Minnesota, and Nevada. As Secretary Toulouse Oliver will tell us, it's essential that a state's chief election official is committed to running free and fair elections and committed to communicating about them truthfully. So the stakes in all 5 of those races were quite high, particularly when thinking about the ability to have free and fair elections in those states in 2024 and beyond. The third thing that we were watching leading up to Election Day were alarming indicators of intimidation and vigilantism aimed at both voters and election officials. The Brennan Center survey of election officials found that over half feared for the physical safety of their colleagues. And in October, the FBI issued a press release warning that 7 states continue to see unusual levels of threats to election workers. During early and mail voting periods before the midterms, we saw intimidation at the polls from vigilante actors, sometimes armed and fueled by the false narrative that the 2020 election was stolen. Fourth, and finally, voters and election workers also face increased threats from official actors, including law enforcement. For example, a National Association of Sheriffs falsely claimed the authority to ignore laws that they deemed to be unconstitutional and have encouraged members to investigate election fraud. While in Florida, the state began prosecuting people with past felony convictions for allegedly registering and voting while ineligible, even though all of the publicly available evidence indicates that those folks genuinely believed that they were eligible to vote. Therefore, it was a mistake, not a case of fraud. But the governor announced these arrests just 5 days before Florida's primary election, and that, coupled with the flimsiness of the cases, suggests that prosecutions were intended to deter even eligible people with felony convictions from voting. Fortunately, though we had those concerns leading up to the midterms, the elections were relatively smooth. There were, of course, the ordinary administrative hiccups that we see during every election, but election workers and election officials worked quickly to resolve them. Some, of course, did attempt to seize on those hiccups to spread misinformation and attempt to undermine confidence in the results, but that largely did not succeed. We saw very high voter turnout for a midterm election, particularly among young voters. But early data suggests that the racial turnout gap persists, that white voters continue to turn out at a higher rate than voters of color. And that is consistent with a long-standing pattern and our knowledge that restrictive voting laws tend to burden minority voters more than white voters. Fortunately, election denialists did pretty poorly at the statewide level. No election denialist Secretary of State candidate won office in a seriously contested race. And when election issues were on the ballot via direct democracy, ballot initiatives, voters largely cast their votes in favor of a more inclusive democracy. So on the whole, democracy came out ahead during the midterms. Looking forward, there are 3 things that I'm paying close attention to this year and through 2024. We are again seeing states introducing restrictive voting legislation at an alarming pace. It's still quite early in the legislative session, and legislatures are still moving these bills through the process, but we will be watching and advocating against policies that make it harder to vote. Second, we anticipate that vigilantism aimed at intimidating voters and election officials will continue, unfortunately. The defeat of the election denialist gubernatorial and Secretary of State candidates may very well mean that we see individuals instead trying to take up their mantle and engage in intimidating tactics. And over the last year, reporting has revealed that well-funded partisan activist organizations were behind, for example, mass voter challenges in Georgia and door-to-door voter intimidation in Colorado. So we could see more of this given that it has been well-funded. Lastly, all eyes will be on the Supreme Court, particularly at the end of June and early July. The court is poised to rule on two major voting cases this term, and the justices could radically reshape the voting rights landscape with decisions in Moore versus Harper and Merrill versus Milligan. Happy to dive in and talk more about those cases as we continue the conversation, but for now, I'll leave it there and look forward to hearing from my fellow panelists.
Thanks so much, Eliza, and you did a wonderful job, setting the table, speaking about the 2022 elections, the midterms. But I do want to ask each panelist, starting with you, Madam Secretary, were the 2022 midterms elections different from others from your vantage point and for the populations you serve? And, outside of what Eliza brought up, what were some of the differences you saw this past election?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Ryan. Thank you to the Peace Development Fund, and thank you to this amazing group of fellow panelists. I'm really honored to be speaking with you all here today, and with those of you who've joined us. So, in the election administration world, and I'm just starting my 17th year of this work, which is crazy because I used to be like a teenager the other day. At least it still feels that way. Every election is different. It's got its own flavor to it. And of course, the most, I think, challenging election cycle that I've been through since I became an election administrator, first at the local level back in the late 2000s, was the 2020 election for a lot of the very obvious reasons that we all see and know about. For years, we have been fighting sort of the continued, what I call Jim Crow 2.0, the attempts to suppress and make it harder for folks to vote that are much more veiled in, things that sound nice, like voter ID, the restriction or the rolling back of early voting locations, removing Sunday voting from communities that are, have relied on that traditionally, consolidation of polling places, right? We see a lot of these tactics that are sort of dressed up in the nice language of the efficiency of the election process, but that really amount to voter suppression. And so here in my state, we've been fighting back against all of those attempts for years. We've been making steady forward progress, like many states have. And, so I think that's the good news, to take from Eliza's initial assessment of kind of where we are, is that while we've seen rollbacks in many states, we're also seeing progress in many states. But the problem is, the more that happens, the more we're creating an unequal voting environment for individuals. And, particularly when we think about federal elections, everybody's got a congressperson on their ballot every 2 years. A third of the country has a senator. And of course, every 4 years, we all have a president on the ballot. And so we have to be concerned about, if not perfectly equal, then as much equality as we can find in voting access. So in 2022, just briefly, because I've already kind of gone on a long time, the challenges that we saw were sort of, I think, the continued flavor of the 2020 election in terms of election denialism in particular, and the fact that, we didn't have a president on the ballot who was sort of leading the charge of election denialism and the chief perpetrator or propagator, if you will, of mis and disinformation. But we saw that there were local organizations, and even though they're networked kind of together across the country, these more local flavors of election denialism taking root here in my state and other states, creating a new threat to the election process. And really, at the end of the day, when we can talk a lot, and hopefully we will tonight, about what election mis and disinformation is, threats to election officials like myself and my colleagues, et cetera, but what it amounts to is an attempt at voter suppression. And so these, again, we're always kind of seeing old things dressed up in new ways, right? The old challenges dressed up in new ways that we have to combat differently and think about differently. And that for us in New Mexico was one of the, one of the main characteristics of the 2022 election.
Thanks so much, Madam Secretary. And thank you for doing what you do. I mean, who would have thought that saying being Secretary of State is a job of danger, and it's not a joke. It's a dangerous job nowadays because of that. So, thank you for doing what you do. Aramis, how about you? 2022. How was it different from your vantage point in out there in Ohio?
Again, I want to reiterate what everybody just said. We are honored to be in this discussion with such great leaders. I was telling my father, I'm going to be on a call with a Secretary of State somewhere. And then he was like, yo, we here, you know what I'm saying? So he was happy. I'm Aramis Sundiata. I am the Executive Director of People's Project. We organize Black and Brown people who are disproportionately affected by state violence and mass incarceration and mass criminalization. And we do that through organizing, civic engagement, and leadership development. So with the question that was posed around the 22 elections, so how we approach elections is simply with this philosophy, is that the electoral process is a nonviolent struggle between two contending sectors of the ruling class for control of the state. That's how we approach the work. And when we discuss democracy, it's a complex idea that requires a lot of books and examination. To see elections and voting as a method, another method, decision-making tools inside of democracy. So when we organize our people, we lead with that. Thus, we understand that the electoral process is something that we can't necessarily rely on for our freedom. We can use it as a tactic to push our agenda forward, because perhaps more than likely it's the most unreliable struggle we can be engaged in. So with that analysis, when it comes to Ohio and our wins here, we learned that when you organize Black and Brown people, you have to be able to give them something to vote for. Thus, oftentimes that deals with not a council member, not a mayor, is usually what's happening in their actual real world. For example, in Akron recently, last year, there was a high-profile murder of a young man named Jalen Walker. Jalen Walker was shot by some cops. You know the story, how it goes. Well, we were able to pass issue 10, which was brought in a robust, what do they call it, citizen review board locally there. But what actually ended up happening was people came to the polls based off of that. Then some of the Democrat Party people who were running won their election. It happened similar here in Columbus when we won the Civilian Review Board as well. I think we had like 70% turnout here from places that normally don't come out to vote. So this is the argument that a lot of our national partners and local partners are trying to push when it comes to the question of this philosophical idealistic position that, you just go to the polls and the mass of the people really are thinking about the executive level. Oftentimes it's not what they're thinking about. They're thinking about what's actually happening in real time in their everyday life. So I will end there.
Yeah.
No,
thanks. Those are great examples. And it's something as a political consultant, we call coattails, right? So if there's something on the ballot that is driving people to the polling place, there's coattails for other folks who happen to be on the ballot as well. So having referendum questions like that are really hyper focused locally, how does that help other people on the ballot? So those are some great examples. Saundra, how about you? How was the 2022 midterms different from your vantage point?
So I, first and foremost, again, I could echo what everyone's already said so far. What an amazing panel, and definitely fangirling a little bit with the Secretary of State, but I love New Mexico, love Atza Chavez and all that they do in Native Vote. And they do such great work and create a great model for all of us. But one of the things that I will say is what really resonated with us at NCAI is this continued pattern of engagement coming out of 2019, where Native voters and grassroots organizers like Native Organizers Alliance, Illuminative, who put out a great 2.0 survey to capture what people do care about, what brings them to the ballot, as we just talked about, what are those issues, those hard-hitting issues, and then rounding that out with amazing other grassroots organizations like Advanced Native Political Leadership, that basically through Indian Country Today, you know, we're hearing and reporting on 143 candidates in the midterm elections, right? Indigenous candidates that filed for city, county, and state and national office during that election. When you hear those numbers and you talk about Indigenous voices going to the ballot and you talk about Indigenous candidates running for office, and people are seeing that, and now we have also that representation in Congress, that is key and important for that level of engagement to continue. The one thing that we have continued to stress and going into the midterms, we knew we would have to keep pushing through is we weren't out of a redistricting litigation cycle yet. We still aren't. Montana is our last holdout state, right? We know that there are some issues there still. We know that we have, again, some additional issues like in Thurston County in Nebraska, when we talk about litigation, Thurston County in Nebraska, where we're fighting against, you know, that now they were supposed to be afforded 4 districts, majority Native districts, and now they were only provided 3. And they've had to sue now 3 times in this type of thing. So when we think about really the work that we do going into midterms, we knew stay the course, find those issues and those talking points that, again, we've all talked about in engaging our local communities and in the work that's going on in the backyard. The other part was local election work, really making sure that we were connected on the ground locally together, and then our national Native organizations and partners. I can't say enough about the partners that we work with, leadership conference, state tables, everyone coming together in community to continue to stay the course and make sure, again, that our data is telling a story. When we look at, you know, 2020, when we talked about majority minority voting districts, you know, and Eliza already said this, we knew the numbers shifted. We knew that we've had the largest census reporting turnout for Native vote, or for Native population data sets. And we also saw that translate into Native voter data. I think that's where we are seeing the difference in the elections, is that there's a level of engagement through the cycle, through census redistricting voting. And people are saying, we're engaged, we're going to sit on committees, we're going to participate, we're going to draw the maps, and we're going to come and we're going to put testimony together. Now, to everyone else's point that's already mentioned this, we got to do our part to help in that, though, and ensure that people, again, do not feel threatened to come and participate in that process, or that they aren't, you know, facing a barrier. And we have a lot of work to do there. And I know we're going to talk about that in this panel today.
Great. No, thank you so much for that, Saundra. Thank you. Eliza, you already kind of spoke when you set the table about 2022. I guess I'm going to change the question up a little bit for you. That we made progress from 2020 to 2022 was what happened in 2020 kind of light the fire under folks. And I know you have the stats on, you know, how many bills are restricting voting access and how many bills. I know the Secretary of State has testified on one in New Mexico about automatic voter registration at the DMVs. So are you all at the Brennan Center tracking that? And are we moving forward, even though there are still some challenges to work on?
So I think Secretary Toulouse Oliver hit the nail on the head. There are states where we're making tremendous progress, and where there's leadership at the local level and across the state committed to making sure people who are registered to vote can overcome whatever barriers are in their way and cast their ballots. making sure people do register to vote and that the process is easy, and to enact laws that remove as many of those barriers out of the way as possible. At the same time, there is a conflicting trend in other states across the country that are making it harder to vote. And increasingly, voters are casting their ballots in one of two Americas, an area that is trying to give, to make good on the promise of democracy and make sure that people can access their right to vote and cast their ballots as easily as possible. And as compared with areas of the country where state legislators are really hell-bent on trying to make it harder for people to vote, and not necessarily harder for everyone in their state, but harder for particular communities to cast their ballots. And in large part, those are communities of color.
Sure.
There are also unintended consequences to efforts to suppress the vote of voters of color, because many of those policies also make it harder for young voters, across the board to cast their ballots, older voters across the board to cast their ballots, rural voters across the board to cast their ballots. So restrictive voting laws are bad for everyone, but we know that they are especially bad for communities that are already marginalized. So we absolutely are making progress. Voting rights restoration for people with felony convictions is an area where we've seen tremendous progress over the last several years, with states across the country restoring voting rights to people living in the community. States like California, Connecticut, New Jersey, by executive order in Kentucky and Iowa. So that is a place where there has been an enormous amount of progress, but of course we're seeing that in states that are typically already trying to protect the right to vote and make it as easy as possible for eligible voters to cast their ballots.
Thanks for that. And one real quick follow-up for you, and then I'm going to pivot to the secretary. So it's becoming more and more lopsided, and there's more of a chasm, and it's getting easier to vote in some states and harder in others. And so like the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, or like some federal standards on how we actually vote, so that there isn't this two Americas that you speak of. Where are we on that? Like, how close are we to having that? I know that obviously we have a new speaker, and Congress is in a different place, or the House is at least. So where are we with that, real quick, and then I'm gonna go to the secretary.
So we were really close. We were really quite close at the end of 2021, or end of 2021, just the very beginning of 2022. I was pausing for time because I happened to be out on parental leave at those key months when we were hoping to push those bills over the finish line. But it continues to be a priority of Democratic lawmakers in the House and in the Senate, and advocates. The Brennan Center is part of a coalition that continues to push for those much needed federal reforms, so we can lift the floor of voting access for everyone across the country and do more to prevent racial discrimination in voting. But I think it is unlikely that we see those reforms pass in this Congress. That doesn't mean we don't need to keep the drumbeat going for democracy reform in Washington, D.C. We need to continue to put this on the plates of our members of Congress and our senators, and tell them how important it is to their constituents that they do pass those bills when the time is right. So it doesn't stop us from advocating for those policies, but we have to have a little bit of political realism at the same time.
Great. Madam Secretary, this might be a more tough question. And I'll preface it by saying my old boss, Governor Patrick, he became an assistant AG under former President Bill Clinton. And one of the reasons was he was a lawyer at the NAACP, and he sued the state of Arkansas for voter rights violations. And Bill and President Clinton remembered him and then hired him. I'm not saying there's voter rights violations going on in New Mexico, but we can always do better, right? And so, what was your experience, or do you have a single experience or one thing in New Mexico that, voter access or disenfranchisement is something that's still kind of there and you're still kind of working on no fault of your own, but, you know, like, how are you working on any of the stuff that's going on in New Mexico?
Well, thanks for the question. And first of all, like, you know, the fact that we're not at perfect, like I never take as a criticism, right? Because we're always striving towards that. We're never going to achieve it. And one of the things I like to say all the time about election administration is that we literally, there's always something to improve upon, something to build upon, something to make better. And we learn something new every election cycle. Some new issue crops up that we were never previously aware of, that we have the opportunity to address. So, you know, to your point earlier about being able to testify in favor of re-enfranchisement for formerly incarcerated folks, for expanding Native voting access, we have a wonderful bill that I'm happy to champion this election cycle. And quite frankly, you know, in response to a lot of the efforts that are being made in other places, right? Where other places are saying we need to move backward, here in my state, we're saying we need to move forward. And so that's just a very powerful, motivating force for me to be part of a movement and an effort to, you know, in the face of trying to move backwards, be a model for moving forward. But you're right, we always have room for improvement. There is always more we can be doing. And so I think this last election cycle, you know, one of the bigger challenges, and I can probably point to 10, but I know we don't have time for all that. So one that really comes to the top of my mind is we have, and in many states, we have the digital divide everywhere. In my state, it is particularly significant for our rural and tribal communities. And, you know, the challenge with it, and excuse me for, I'm getting over the flu still, which nobody get this flu. It is horrible. it's not a fun thing. But anyway, you know, we had some challenges this last election cycle in some of our rural tribal areas where the digital divide component became really stark. And so for me, you know, as an election administrator, you know, sometimes we're expected to quote unquote stay in our lane and really focus specifically on, you know, the rules around how do you run an election. Well, for me, it just really re-emphasized the need to be a broader advocate for things like broadband access, you know, because it has obviously incredibly important cultural and economic and educational implications, but it also affects the ability for us to administer elections in a fair and equitable way, right? If I want a voter in the, you know, the middle of urban Albuquerque, you know, where you can basically, you know, walk out your door and you don't have to walk more than a mile to the nearest polling place. But in rural, especially rural tribal New Mexico, you have to go a really long way to go to a polling place because we do things digitally now and we need that internet access. You know, that is a challenge that we really need to overcome and that I'm particularly excited to champion.
That's great. Yeah, and digital divide, you're right. If you can provide access to folks who have problems, it's like you said, not only educational, economic, health, you know, a lot of telehealth going on nowadays, but I hadn't really thought about the voter disenfranchisement of folks who have problems with broadband or the Wi-Fi. Aramis, how about you? Any particular jarring cases of voter disenfranchisement or lack of voter access in Ohio that you all experienced? And if you can do it in a short amount of time, what have you all done to right that?
Well, let me just say this, like, you know, we did not get anything in this country without the shedding of our blood, period. So you can put any mechanism in front of the oppressed classes and they will come out. It doesn't matter what you do, because the self-determination of the people is very strong. And that is the contending forces, because oftentimes we organize our people, we understand that the electoral process was created by the means of the ruling class to avoid war amongst itself, while competing with other resources and markets around the world. It was not constructed with the intent for, or the assumption for Africans who were enslaved and other peoples to participate in this process. It was assuming that only white leaders, white male leaders, white bourgeoisie will be the main representation of this so-called country. Therefore, when we shed our blood, we will win. It doesn't really matter what they do. History teaches us this. So they can put a roadblock. You remember in South Africa and the ANC in the 80s when Nelson Mandela came out for his first election, the ANC, they were in lines in Soweto to just elect him. That gives you hope. In Chile, when Allende was coming into it, they were in lines. So if the people want to come out, they will shed their blood and they will sacrifice. It will come out. No matter what research they put out there to tell you you can't do it, I wish they would tell Mary Bell down the street that she can't cast her ballot because so-and-so is at the polling place. I guarantee you she'll pull up with her cousins and uncles and get that vote in. The people will shed their blood, my brother. We have hope here.
I very much appreciate that. I do. I very much appreciate where you're coming from and the systemic racism in our electoral process that's there. Saundra, how about you? Is there some effective ways currently available to support people in exercising their right to vote, or was there some examples that you all have found that are jarring that you then tried to address or did address?
So first and foremost, I appreciate what was just mentioned about this idea of this mark of history. We will be celebrating 100 years of Indian citizenship in this country in 2024, going into that general election. That will mark 100 years. And that's super crucial when you talk about voting and voting rights, considering that it wasn't until even into the 60s and 70s that beyond that, we had some of our last states actually recognizing language assistance or even providing that provision for Native people to vote. So that was super, super, super huge for us. I think one of the things that I do want to address in the question you just asked is, yes, I mentioned Thurston County, but I mentioned some other which we've already mentioned here, voter suppression, laws, and those tend to still surround the same things. Voter ID laws, which we know suppress in Native communities, not accepting tribal IDs in many places where we know a tribal ID is acceptable in many ways to include fly with. Also thinking through, we just talked about Native American Voting Rights Act. NAVRA, as we call it, is another place where we're looking at those laws where we saw, again, and I know the secretary already mentioned this, but those polling places and drop boxes in Indian country where it was kind of like a last-ditch effort where they just said, oh, well, we're not going to offer those anymore, or we're not going to allow you to then create those on reservation. Considering tribes are sovereign nations, right? That government-to-government relationship, that was another concern and an issue, and our NAVRA does address that. But that was another issue in a lot of cases, especially like in Elko County in Nevada, we had to bring suit. Four Directions was behind helping to bring suit there, and alongside North Native American Rights Fund. And so when we think about those things, quickly I'll say, that's where we have to think about effective tactics and prioritizing the way that we strategize with our groups on the ground to ensure that everyone knows those laws, those voter ID laws that I just mentioned, polling locations, what your rights are. When you're sitting on a call, we should ensure that everyone has a sense of that this is not okay. You can't tell me to do this. I sat on a call, for example, in Montana, where they were trying to set up a polling location. And thank goodness we did have lawyers from NARF on the call, because they were doing everything to push back and say, well, we don't think this is a good idea. This place isn't a good idea. There was all of this pushback. And of course, the attorney comes on and says, that's not legal. So let's have a conversation about that. And those are some important things, because you're not always going to have someone in the room that has that legal language.
Thank you for that. So we have somebody in the room with some legal background. And those Supreme Court cases that you mentioned, Eliza, that's news to me. So those two cases, one was Moore, and there's another one. Can you, again, and I'm sorry, in a quick amount of time, kind of sum those up, so we can know what to expect, and hopefully we'll cross our fingers with this Supreme Court that we have, that maybe they make the right decision.
Sure. So the two cases I mentioned are Moore versus Harper and Merrill versus Milligan. Both cases the court has heard oral argument last year, so we're just waiting for a decision. In Moore versus Harper, the issue is about partisan gerrymandering in North Carolina for the state's congressional districts. The North Carolina Supreme Court ruled that the congressional map drawn by the legislature violated the state's own constitution. But rather than accept the decision of their state's highest court, several legislatures went to the US Supreme Court to argue that the state court and the state constitution cannot, as a matter of law, constrain what they, as the state legislature, do when they regulate federal elections. And that argument is grounded in what is now known as the independent state legislature theory. That's a highfalutin name that doesn't really say what it is. But the theory is basically that state legislatures get to make rules for federal elections and nobody else in the state can do so or can place any limits on the state legislature. That theory is incorrect as a matter of law. It has been debunked over and over again and been rejected in previous cases by the US Supreme Court. But nevertheless, the case made it back to the US Supreme Court last year. At oral argument, several even conservative justices expressed a healthy skepticism to this dangerous notion during oral argument. But the concern here is that state legislatures, if they were permitted to act under the independent state legislature theory, could adopt vote suppressive legislation, partisan gerrymanders, without any checks or balances on that authority from the ordinary lawmaking process, like a gubernatorial veto, state courts, state constitution. So the election administration and voting rights and fair representation are really at stake in Moore versus Harper. In Merrill versus Milligan, the court is reviewing, again, this is about districting. The Supreme Court is reviewing a decision by a lower court that found that Alabama's new congressional map was substantially likely to violate the Voting Rights Act. That map perpetuated discrimination against Black voters by packing a large segment of Black voters into a single heavily Black congressional district and cracking the remaining voters among multiple districts dominated by white voters. That strategy of packing and cracking is a long-standing strategy for racial gerrymandering, and it dilutes the voting power of communities of color. The court, based on oral argument, seems poised to recalibrate the framework for deciding whether redistricting is discriminatory under the Voting Rights Act. And any decision that reworks the test for deciding whether there has been racial gerrymandering is likely to undermine the ability of voters of color to have an equal opportunity to participate, to elect the candidates of their choice, and achieve fair representation. So these are really incredibly high stakes cases that the court is poised to decide.
Got it. Thank you so much for that. Madam Secretary, I believe it was you who brought up disinformation, and a good Secretary of State, or what we have in Massachusetts, a Secretary of the Commonwealth, is doing a lot of giving out information for folks around voting. So there's the information about where to vote, how to vote, all that other jazz, early voting, whatever, what have you. But then there's disinformation when it comes to the politics. And so, how does access to accurate information impact voter turnout in elections that you've seen? And can you speak a bit about the strategies to combat misinformation, which is something, a new responsibility of a Secretary of State to combat all this misinformation that is coming down the pike to folks?
Well, I love what Aramis said. I mean, really, at the end of the day, if we're giving people something to vote for, we can't keep them away from the polls. And I think that's the thing that we always have to keep in mind. And I couldn't agree with that philosophy more. And at the same time, as a government official, as an election official, and as a cheerleader for democracy, which is what I try to see my role as the chief election official, it's also my responsibility to make sure voters have accurate and, frankly, easily digestible, understandable information about where, when, and how to cast their ballot, because at the end of the day, if we can confuse, conflate, make it challenging to find that information, that can be a barrier. And if we allow lies about the election process to subvert the truth about how the election process works, that can be suppressive. Folks can choose to opt out of the process if they fundamentally believe that the system is rigged or unfair or inaccurate. And so, you know, unfortunately, I think, you know, on the one hand, I love to spend time doing as much voter education as possible. We do a lot of work in my office, and a lot of my colleagues do, really on both sides of the aisle, quite frankly, to put out accurate information about how, where, and when to cast your ballot, and to really demystify the election process as much as we can. It's a very complex process on the back end, but the front end voter, you know, interface process should be as simple and clear cut and easily understandable as possible. And so when we have had the tools, and so this is the thing to keep in mind, and this is by design, elections are some of the most systemically underfunded and you know, challenged processes. You know, it's the underpinning of our democracy, right? Every election, that's the underpinning. And I do, again, I want to acknowledge Aramis because he said so many powerful things tonight. There are more ways to be involved than just voting. But, you know, that fundamental process of casting your ballot is so critical. We don't have the resources we need to do what we need to do to run elections, much less to do the proactive information you know, provisions that we want to do. So we need more resources to do better. When we have had those resources, we definitely see improvement in turnout, because there's inevitably individuals who are intimidated or mystified by the process, where when we can demystify and provide that information, it makes a world of difference.
No, thanks for that, and thanks again for doing what you do. Aramis, I'm going to come back to you in a second, but I want to go to Saundra first. Saundra, can you speak to the history of Indigenous voting rights and how is that affecting today's laws and policies? And excuse me for being in Massachusetts, where we don't have large populations of Indigenous folks, and so some of it's new to me. So a little bit of the history on that would be helpful, and how exactly it's affecting today's laws.
You know, I think one of the things that I just mentioned, you know, that idea of that 100 years, right, of Indian citizenship, but also thinking through that when we start to stand up laws like a Native American Voting Rights Act, and when that came about, you know, following, and as I just mentioned, 60s and 70s, and you think about enmeshing that kind of with boarding school policy, which a lot of people think was years upon years ago in the 1800s. And I remind them, no, my grandmother actually went to boarding school. So within generations. And you think about that idea of disconnect, and Aramis said it so beautifully, that idea of the struggle, where you have these leaders that came out of things like boarding school, where it was meant to disconnect you from culture, from community, from voice, from story, from history, and again, suppress everything about who you are as an identity, right, as a person. And then you fast forward that into people starting to pick apart and say, okay, we need to, as I just talked about the language assistance, right, where we went back to the books and said, wait a second, you know, one of the, like Navajo Nation, where we need to be providing language assistance for these different communities that are still battling and facing, even though we have citizenship, even though we have these voting rights laws, they still are not getting the support and assistance to actually go and effectively cast a ballot, because we are denying them those services. But then you fast forward to 2020, and you're still seeing that. You're still seeing those same suppressive tactics. You're still seeing what Maggie said that was so important in states where people are driving, and I want people to think about this, you're driving thousands of miles just to cast a ballot, like in Alaska, where you're having to drive hundreds of miles, even in states like my state that I live in Nevada, to cast a ballot. And then when you get there, you're facing someone that says, well, we need to match your signature. Well, wait a second, did you bring that ID? Well, wait a second. And then there's all these additional things. The other thing that we face is, and this is what I hear from Native voters a lot, how do I know that when I cast the ballot, it's not going to get purged? How do I know it's actually going to count? As we have seen in places like Arizona and other states where we have seen purged ballots in the hundreds. So now we're creating a system of unchecked balances where we can't always confirm that it's going to count. And so that's the other part that we have to get to. And that's what the Native American Voting Rights Act, NAVRA, is hoping to do in this long history of suppressive tactics. It's creating toolkits and resources through grassroots organizations like New Mexico has with New Mexico Native Vote, California Native Vote, and others, to create toolkits to get out to people to say, here's how you can do this, not just register to vote, but here's how you can access. Here's how you can make sure that your voice counts. And here's the follow-up. And guess what? If you face a barrier, we have Native American Rights Fund and other organizations like Lawyers Committee and Election Protection that's going to help you.
Well, thanks for that. Thank you very, very much. Aramis is, each panelist has commented on some of the stuff you've said, some powerful stuff. Help square this away for me. You mentioned, the system was not built for anybody except rich white, or not rich, but white male landowners to vote. And that's the same, similar system that we're in today. But at the same time, you're saying nobody's going to keep anybody away from voting. And so there's this always a struggle in all types of systems, especially systemic racism. Do you try to fix the system from the inside, or do you try to destroy and dismantle the system? And so I know that's a large question, but what are your thoughts on those two, those battling things where you want to make things better for everybody? Do you destroy it and dismantle it, or do you try to change it from the inside out?
Short answer, yes. We live in the headquarters of colonial domination, not only domestically, but abroad. Thus, we have to move differently in these current border United States. So when we discuss these contradictions, the struggle is beautiful. We have the ability to shift minds and have people believe in something higher than themselves, you see. And the tactics that we use, from voting to community organizing to legislative things, like, it's a beautiful process. And then part of the process as well is that when people are conscious enough to lead by themselves and to make their own choices within organization, because like Saundra just said, again, people will drive thousands of miles to be engaged in the process. You see, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a determination thing of the people when you see what they're willing to do to participate. And that's where we find glory in the struggle. That's where we see, yes, we have to be also honest with our bases. That's how we find success in our organizations, where we're not, coercing them in some type of philosophical, idealistic position that there's a right to vote and this is that. It is a concession given from the bourgeoisie to the oppressed masses. It's a concession. It's not nothing to do with no rights. We have to shed our blood again. So therefore, when we say these things to the people, they have a more sense of self in the process when they go cast their ballot. They see themselves as actors in history, as opposed to being just a person that's going to the polls because some TV show told them to. Now, to the question of disinformation, it is up to us who have the privilege to guide this process, to make sure we are examination of all the reactionary forces that are coming at us. It is up to us to be leading that process. Because you have CNN, MSC, Facebook, Twitter, you have all the things that can literally confuse the base. So therefore, we have to be razor focused and disciplined and more vigilant in our struggle, just for people to have access to the lowest form of political action, which is the vote. And that is the process that we have been blessed to be able to engage in this conversation, also in our work locally and state. I hope that answered your question.
No. I'll use a word you used, and that was beautiful. So thank you for that. Doing closing question, so a minute each, so we can leave time for folks who've been probably chomping at the bit to ask a question themselves. There's two of them, and I guess I'll start with Eliza. You can answer one or the other or both, and I'm going to ask everybody the same exact questions. What are the opportunities to forward social justice issues in this climate, and what gives you hope? So if you can do a minute, we want to do a minute so we can give folks the chance to ask questions going forward. So Eliza first, and then we'll go to the secretary.
So I think the opportunities to advance social justice today are really going to be found at the local level in communities and with your state and local reps and government officials. While there might not be a Congress that is has their ears open to be responsive to democracy reform, you will find your community is interested in that. You will find your maybe local supervisor of elections or local auditor who is interested in finding ways to help voters cast their ballots. It is much easier to make a phone call and get some time in front of your state rep or state senator than it is to get in front of your member of Congress or your US senator. And those folks need your votes. So it is worth building those relationships within your community and with your state and local government reps. And that's why I'm hopeful in the short term.
Thank you for that. Madam Secretary, same questions. What are the opportunities to forward social justice issues in this climate, and what gives you hope?
So first of all, echo everything Eliza just said. All politics are local, said a famous former politician. And
A Massachusetts one, by the way.
I know. And so in terms of that too, I mean, the states can be the models, right? The states and local government can be the models. And when we champion pro-democracy policies and when we succeed at implementing them, right, that is where we can send a message to our federal lawmakers potentially that these things can happen. And what's giving me really so much hope right now in that regard in particular is, as we've seen so many of the challenges that have arisen in the last several years, seeing the up and coming generation, Gen Z, the Zoomers, whatever you want to call them, be so engaged, so educated, so much more, so much further advanced than even I am, at approaching 50. And seeing them vote and seeing them just be so knowledgeable and ask such amazing questions. Oh my gosh, I got to tell you, I have so much hope for the future of this country and of the world for that.
No, thank you. Thank you. Saundra, same. What are the opportunities to forward social justice issues in this climate, and what is giving you hope?
I think Aramis said it perfectly. Let's use our tools. Let's use the tools that have been afforded to us. Let's use those in a strategic and effective way. Eliza said it also. Let's use those tools and engage in our local community. We know that there are broadband grants out there and have been for infrastructure building across Indian country. It's one of the things that we were able to effectively try to leverage, especially when everything was shut down. So let's learn from that period and use those tools effectively to really connect us better in this work. And that goes with something that Maggie just mentioned, what the secretary just mentioned, is about youth, engaging our youth in that generation, that voice that's so powerful. They know how to use technology. Ask my 12-year-old. She teaches me every day, but they know how to use that technology in a way to message what really is at the heart of things. The other thing I want to say is also use things like the executive order that Biden put out that put out the Voting Rights Act to federal agencies. How are we tracking what those federal agencies' plans are and their strategies? Are we holding them accountable for that work and following up with them? We have 2 schools, for example, following up with youth, Haskell and Sippy, that came online as those designated voter registration sites. Let's continue to march that and expand that. Let's use what we have. That gives me hope.
Thanks so much. Before I go to you, Aramis, folks at home, if you have questions, now's the time to put them in the chat. either for everyone to see or to Laura or Sophia, and they'll send to me. So please put your questions in the chat as Aramis does this last question from me. What are the opportunities afford social justice issues in this climate, and what gives you hope moving forward?
We are at a critical point in history that's glorious. And oftentimes we say, through these struggles, it's only a question of the people's consciousness catching up to the material conditions. And oftentimes the consciousness develops and the masses lag behind the material conditions. But however, with the uncompromising political program and agitation should be priority to us. Thus, hope always comes through what we always say: organize, organize, organize. Because once you organize, you win. There's always hope. We don't lose hope. We have hope in the people to lead for themselves. That's the final analysis. And we really strongly say this a lot: organization is our only defense.
Thanks. Thank you so much. So let's see in the chat here. We have, let me just make sure I don't miss any questions. If I do miss any questions, Laura and Sophia are going to help. But the first one I see is from Sonia Epstein. This is for Aramis. I know that PJP does a lot of really powerful work around police brutality. What is the intersection between that and voting rights?
Oh yeah, so that's a great question. I think people get it. Often people get it confused. So you have issues that you organize, and then you have programs that you run to organize the people. So when it comes to voting rights, it intersects because we have coalition. People Justice Project has probably is the vanguard in our city, we're proud to say. And we have the ability to have coalition with a lot of voting rights organizations where we're able to lead a lot of organizing and voter registration campaigns in our local. And so when it comes to voter rights, in Columbus, there's not really a lot of pushback with the right to vote. It's oftentimes, how do we get people to the polls? So for example, when election cycle happens here or in Ohio, in the triple Cs, which is Columbus, Cleveland, Cincinnati, there are scientific ways that we get people to the polls to make sure people get there. Make sure the information is correct. However, people come into the door based off of their relationship to police brutality, relationship to the state. We have all the civic engagement things, candidate forums, stuff like that, but it's really just the entry point for those who come into our organization.
Got you. So I think when your first answers was, kind of answers this too, like the intersection between police brutality and voting is something happens and it's motivating people to vote.
Yes, because when they vote, like we won several campaigns locally with ballot initiatives and stuff like that because we're doing voting. Mm-hmm. And so will we ever get in our ignorance if we're purists and say, oh, we don't want to vote? You know what I mean? It's like, it's ridiculous. It makes no sense.
Sure. I get it. Any other questions, folks? This is a very esteemed panel. Little bit of time. Laura, how are we doing on time? It's 8:10.
Yeah, we got another 10 minutes or so for questions. So other questions, folks?
If not, in the meanwhile, we do have a sitting statewide elected official here. And I know I saw in your bio, because I did do a little other work on all your folks' bios, that you were at one point either the chair or the co-chair of the National Association of Secretary of States, and so what, do you do? I know the answer to that, but give me an answer on how much you all are talking to each other and how much you're sharing, and how, one state's doing something better than another state, and how can you replicate that? Is there a lot of that going on, or are you also just kind of tunnel focused on your own state?
That's a good question. Thanks, Ryan. And yeah, I was the president of NAS, National Association of Secretaries of State, from July 2020 to August 2021. Or yeah, so I had the dubious honor
Nice.
of being the president of NAS during the 2020 election. And in fact, not to be hyperbolic, but it was by virtue of that position that I ended up on this website called Enemies of the State, which targeted me and 70 other election officials across the country for death. And a Bitcoin wallet was collected for bounties on our heads. So yeah, to your earlier point, this is not and I, my natural response is to laugh at things that are just tragic. So I apologize for that. But so it's been interesting. I think one of the biggest challenges that I'm seeing, we definitely have an opportunity, and NAS is the nation's oldest bipartisan professional organization for elected officials. So, we know there's the National Governors Association, there's the National Association of Council of State Legislatures. NAS is the oldest. So we have this very old bipartisan tradition. Most of us are the chief election officials in our states, although that's not completely true in every state. And so we do have an opportunity. And I think, what I will say, just briefly to finish the thought, is we have an opportunity to talk and share best practices. The politics that have been created, particularly in the past several years, the politics of election denialism have made it really hard for my Republican colleagues. And I will say again, many of whom, we may disagree on a lot of things policy-wise, but they know the truth about the accuracy and integrity of our election systems. And the politics on the right in particular have put them in a, politically tough place where they have to try to appease the very vocal base of sort of election deniers and those who are propagating mis and disinformation, and the reality of what we're really facing conducting elections, which is not, any of the lies and the mis and disinformation that the election deniers are posing. So we're in a tough spot. I am the chair again. I was once before, and I am now the co-chair again of our elections committee in NAS. And so it's going to be an interesting year of trying to navigate these really sticky, ugly, complicated politics.
No, thanks for that. And the bipartisan issue you brought up is, who was the Secretary of State, and was it Georgia, or who did Trump call and say, hey, I just need these votes, right? And so
that's Brad Raffensperger in Georgia.
Yeah, Raffensperger, right? And so he was in such a tough spot, and politically he was in a tough spot. So thank you for that. I believe Paul has a question. I don't know if you wanted to come on and ask your question, Paul, or type it or send it to me.
It would be easier if it'd be easier for me to ask it, because I could confuse everybody trying to write it. So.
Go ahead, go for it, Paul.
But Peace Development Fund is, we're all about the grassroots, but we're also all about the sandwich, which is the top and I'm not going to say bottom, but the elected. We work at the UN level and we work at the grassroots level. That's a sandwich of some capacity and power. So the fact that Aramis and Maggie, to use you as an example, are your two slices of that, what we need to get this done. We're movement builders. That's what we're about. And so the fact that you all are connecting across this spectrum is obviously what we love to see and what we love to do, and any way we can help it happen is what PDF's about. But more importantly, it's about what neither sector, neither slice of that sandwich can do it without the other. So how do we strengthen those? The fact that you all four now know each other in a new way is important. It's not just, we got on a Zoom and we went away. No, now it's important. You have the capacity to talk across those built-in boundaries that this system sets in place all the time. So, if all the barriers, all the ways that has been discussed here with Eliza and everybody, this is structural. That's what we've been talking about. But no matter what happens, the humans, the folks on the ground are dynamic. They're interested. So how do we make the best advantage of all of that to, for the long haul, not for the next cycle, but for the long haul. That's what we're really trying to do. And, just being it for me sitting here, this is awesome for me sitting here listening to how you all are seeing it, all those different pieces. And I don't know if it's so much a question as it's an affirmation of the work that each of you all are doing and the criticality of the relationship across those slices of that sandwich. I like to say always that organized communities turn out organized voters. So no, we don't do voter organizing. We work on housing, we work on healthcare, we work on school issues. But when it comes time to vote, our folks know what time it is and they go out and so that community organizing slice is essential to what Maggie's doing, to what Eliza, what you're doing, to Saundra, what you're doing. It's just, those are the ingredients of success. And that's what I see assembled here on the panel. I want to say really thank you. And, I couldn't turn that into a question for you, Ryan. So.
Oh, but I mean, it's a wonderful comment, and I'm sure some people have follow-up comments on what you just said. So I don't know if somebody wants to unmute themselves and go first and follow. Go ahead, Saundra.
You said something really important, which was the art of sustainable approach. And this idea of how do you get the ingredients mixed together in such a really wonderful stew, right? That stew, that hearty stew that really gets us moving. And that's one of the things that I really appreciated when I came in to NCAI in 2019. I had someone reach out and ask me, they said, Saundra, how are we going to make this sustainable in Indian country? How are we going to continue to make sure that this is year in and year out, and it's not just in these cycles, right? That we're constantly engaged. And my commitment to him at that time in Arizona is that we're going to do it, and we're going to do it day by day, hour by hour, conversation by conversation, and battle by battle. I love that Aramis said we bleed every time we go to the ballot box, because we do. We come with passion and intent, and we bring our ancestors with us. And NCAI being since 1944, one of our first resolutions was on voting rights. And here we are 80 years later, and we still are working towards that end. Sustainability, continuing to build that beautiful, wonderful stew that we continue to work together on to make it great.
Awesome. Any other comments on the sandwich that Paul said? In politics, we call it grass tops, which is kind of easy grassroots, and I do some grass top stuff. But the sandwich. Anybody else have any comments on what Paul, the executive director, had to say? Everybody gave a thumbs up. Sonia asked me, and I think this is a kind of a closing thing. Question for Ryan, if that's allowed. What has your past work on various campaigns and a range of offices taught you about elections, and what gives you hope? And so, yeah, I mean, we get into, and I'm sure all of you have been in elections, especially the secretary. You get into the weeds on certain elections, and it gets to the point where like, oh, that machine seems to break in that ward every election. Somehow Ward 1A, where all the Puerto Ricans live, is broken, and that one's backed up, right? And so you start to have some institutional knowledge about what's going to happen at a certain election, and you try to remedy it on the front end. And those are some micro specific things, but when you take a step back, it's systemic racism, and that's why. And they can say, well, we don't break it on purpose. Well, you send all the old machines over here for some reason, and well, they vote more, so they get the newer machines because we don't want. And so like they try to actually come up with reasoning on why they're being racist in the way they're running their elections, right? So those things have happened before, and people being turned away from the polls, and those heated types of elections, but. In summation, what gives me hope is this, right? And so from PDF sponsoring this and putting this together and bringing this wonderful panel together, for somebody, the secretary's level who's extremely busy, to be here to speak with us is great. And Saundra and Eliza, with all your expertise and everything you're doing, being here as well. And then Aramis as well, showing us that sandwich that we were speaking about, and how folks have to work together, right? We all know we all can work together. We can all play our part, and do what we need to do, and listen to others and empower others to do their part as well. So that's what gives me hope. We do have like we can probably give everybody one last minute to kind of sum up what happened tonight. That was my last minute. You won't hear from me anymore. Thank you, everybody. We'll go to Eliza. We haven't heard from her in a little bit. You can give us your last closing remark, and we'll move on throughout.
Thanks, Ryan. I guess I want to acknowledge that something that Aramis and Saundra have shared, that, you know, Americans have throughout our history fought and bled to access their right to vote. And that's absolutely true. But I just want to sort of state the obvious, which is it shouldn't have to be that way. And that's what, you know, I am fighting for, and that I know I'm in community with all of you and with advocates across the country fighting so that it doesn't, you know, cost an arm and a leg, in some cases literally, for folks to be able to vindicate that most important right. So it's really been a pleasure to talk with all of you.
Thank you. Saundra.
You know, I think one of my last thoughts with this panel, and something that comes up quite often for me, is this idea that we saw in 2020 some of our youngest voters casting a ballot, and actually in some of our communities, first-time voters that were reported at 80 years of age going and casting a ballot in some of our Native communities. And the fact that we have those stories to tell, and that, again, going back to this idea that something brought them to that space, something brought them to be able to engage and participate, I think is really what I continuously go back to in this work. You know, we're getting ready to launch our outreach tour and go out on the road, our road show, if you will, out to our communities to do some active listening. And I think that's also the part of this process that I want to stress, is that it's not always about us going and creating these wonderful toolkits and doing these social messages. And that's really great too. But sometimes it's just sitting down and breaking bread and having tea with people and saying, hey, let's really listen, and let's have a conversation so that we can engage in that way and break it down. And that's also too what this process is about, and is healing in some ways, so that, to Eliza's point, you know, I want to get to the point where we don't have to file a lawsuit, right? Just for something that should be common sense and should be afforded to everyone. So.
Thank you for that, Saundra, and thank you for all your insight this evening. Aramis, any closing remarks?
Not really. I mean, I really enjoyed this conversation. It was fun. And also, one thing I will say is that we have a very strong position, that we have a duty to fight for our freedom, as Assata Shakur teaches us. And we also know that politics is war without bloodshed, and war is politics with bloodshed. And that's how we approach the work. And we're aggressive with it, unforgiving and relentless, because we have responsibility to the people. And again, I want to say thank you for having us here to discuss this topic today.
Thanks, Aramis. Thank you so much. And it might be helpful for some folks at home, and this is for Saundra and Eliza too, if there is a website that we can see and help support the work that you're doing, please drop it in the chat if you're able, as well. And then I thought we lost the secretary, but Madam Secretary's back. And so 1 minute left on closing, and then we're done.
Well, just thanks again. Sorry, speaking of digital divide, you know, here in urban Santa Fe, my connection dropped out. So I apologize for that, but just, it's been a pleasure. You know, for me, it's, you know, easy to get very focused and in the weeds on the work of election administration. And obviously I come to this work from a place of belief in our democracy, social justice, wanting to see the people of our country and of our states make change, make positive social change. but it's very easy to get lost in the weeds and to get really focused on the specifics of how we do elections. And so being a part of conversations like this is just a reminder for me of why I do this work and why we're all in this work. And it's not done in a vacuum. And so I just want to express my gratitude for that and for including me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I don't know if anybody from PDF has closing comments or if I'm just saying good night to everybody. Sophia or Laura or Paul.
Thank you, everybody, for being part of this. Sophia, take us out.
All right, I got a super quick poll for you guys. It's just some multiple choice questions. So let me go ahead and put that up here. All right, it should be live now. Let me know if you are able to see that.
I can see it. So I think others should
Perfect,
be able
thank
to
you.
as well. Yep.
Ryan, I'll say one last sign out, which is that this is the work we got to do every day. I mean, this is what you all are doing every day. We get up and go to work to do this. And the more we can do it with each other without the, the isolation that comes with this and the challenges that come with this, whether it's tech or whether it's money or whether it's, visibility, airtime in the madness of everything that's on social world. So just being able to do this and have this conversation is important. And I know these conversations go on in everybody's kitchens and living rooms all the time and in the car on the way to work or whatever. But this is what makes it move. This is where any, this kind of cross-sector, cross-pollination, cross-culture, whatever relationship building this is what they're afraid of out there. And the more we do it, the more they're afraid and the more reactionary they get. But that's our job. That's what we got to do. We got to keep showing up and doing it. And you all are showing up and doing it awesome today. I'm thrilled and very respectful and thankful that you all participated with us.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for having us. And so everybody have a great night, whether you're on the East Coast or West Coast, but thank you so much. And thanks, panel, for being so great.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the panel. Thank you, Ryan, for a fabulous job. And let's keep fighting the good fight, you all. I've got hope. So, and Aramis, you gave me hope today beyond what I usually have. So thank you all. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.